Hi, I'm Amy. Thank you for tuning in. Today I'm joined by my lovely friend, Rachel FATUROTI. Rachel is the author of the upcoming middle grade debut, Sadé and Her Shadow Beasts, and she's also the author of the YA book, Finding Folkshore, which will be coming out in September. So thank you so much for joining us, Rachel. I've wanted to interview you for absolutely ages.
I'm so excited to be here. Can't wait.
Thank you. Okay, so do you want to start off? We'll talk about your middle grade first, since that comes out in July, and then we'll move on to your YA, if that's okay. So can you tell us a little bit about Sadé for us to begin with?
So Sadé and Her Shadow Beast follows 12-year-old Sadé, whose mum recently passes away, and she escapes into her magical imaginary world with lilac candy floss skies and talking creatures. However, as Sadé's anxiety grows, she soon realizes that there are shadow beasts living in her world, and they soon start seeping into the real world. So essentially, it's a story about finding your own voice and, I guess, overcoming grief.
Well, it's such a beautiful story. I was really lucky. I read a really early version of this. I'm sure it's changed a little bit along the way, but I think at its heart, your writing always struck me, the voice of it, the characters, and the way that you deal so beautifully with difficult subjects. And I wanted to ask you about that. So it's a very light book in some ways about Sadé making friends, and like you said, the beautiful things about her world, but also you deal with some really difficult subjects. Can you tell us a little bit about how you went across balancing that, and what you were thinking when you went into writing it that way?
Well, naturally, I think humor always seeps into my writing anyway. So even if it is a sad subject, I always find ways to inject hope, I would say, and elements of joy. So I would say a lot of my books are bittersweet rather than just sad. So I think through the characters is a great way I try and inject that lightheartedness. So I usually have quite diverse casts with quite funny characters, and I think that balances out maybe a more sensitive or a sadder topic. So see, with Sadé, it's grief. And along the way, Sadé meets a lot of different amazing characters. And I think that injects some joy and, I guess, happiness into her world, rather than it just being solely about grief.
Yeah, and I think one thing that really struck me as well is the fact that she sort of learns that she's not alone in it, and she meets, other young people who are going through that as well, and obviously she has her family to support her too. So how do you approach character development? Because I really, really love your characters. I think especially her family members. Like, I had a really soft spot for her dad, and her siblings, and without me giving too much away, the friends that she meets along the way. How did you go about creating such kind of vivid, like, realistic characters?
I think part of it is based on real life, and then I guess part of it is make believe. So with siblings, because I am the youngest, I find it quite easy to write sibling relationships because I can base it on my real life. So Sadé's older sister Talani, she's actually partially based on a relationship I have with my sister. So I think that was quite easy to write. And other than that, I would say just people around me, people I see. So I'm a huge fan of train spotting, or people spotting, I should say. So I might see somebody on the train that's dressed in a really cool way, or they look very interesting, or they're talking in a certain way, and I'm like, wow, they'll make amazing characters. So I guess it's different. Sometimes I draw from my own life, my own experiences, or people I see, and sometimes I just make things up. So it might be the case of I come up with a character based on a piece of dialogue, or something somebody's described about them. So that is how essentially I come up with my characters, I would say.
Yeah, I think that definitely comes across because they were so believable, and it makes sense now how realistic the sibling interactions were.
Yeah.
You've obviously been there with your sister.
Yes.
So in the version I read, poetry played a really big part. I'm assuming, does that still carry on in the kind of finished version? Okay,
so.
yeah. So how did you, like, I know you're a poet as well. Did you find it difficult to write the poetry? Did it come separately to the plot, or did it feel quite integrated? I was just wondering, how did that happen?
I think it came quite easy at the beginning, I would say, because I'd always wanted prose and I guess poetry to intertwine. So there were more points in the book, in the earlier version, I would say, where it almost bleeds in. So the prose bleeds into poetry. I think at other times when I wasn't sure what I wanted to say, it would be a bit harder. And then I would have to say, okay, placeholder, I'm going to come back to you. And then I guess, write the poem separately because I had to be inspired or had to know what I wanted to write about. But I guess initially, no. As we went further along, I would say yes in some parts, yeah.
Is it like developing the voice where you feel like when you've got the voice of your narrator, right, and it just starts to flow? Is it similar with poetry, or do you have to approach each poem separately?
Yes, I think it is very much linked to voice. I think another element I struggled with was because I can write poetry as Rachel, but I wasn't writing poetry as Rachel, I was writing poetry as Sadé. And it's almost like, what would Sadé's voice be like? What would her poetry be like? And is it authentic to her and her character? So I guess not only was I writing poetry, I was writing as Sadé. So thinking about her and what she's thinking, what she's feeling, what she knows, what she doesn't know. So yes, I guess it intertwined with character development in that way.
Oh gosh, that's a whole extra level of complexity. I'm not a poet, so I was in awe of your poetry anyway, but then just the extra layers of it is really interesting how you had to approach that. So kind of on that subject, I was wondering, you wrote, which of your books did you write first? Did you write Finding Folkshore first?
Yes,
this is the way publishing works. So the way you wrote first and then you wrote the middle grade, but they're coming out in the opposite order. So how did you find that shift between writing for a middle grade audience and for a young adult audience?
So hard. I am a YA author through and through, naturally. I find it much easier. I think it was a great challenge for me to almost age down and shift the voice, because naturally, as you'll find, my voice always skews a bit older. So I love challenges. So it was a great challenge. It was nice. It was a good challenge, but I definitely found it harder to write the middle grade and to find the voice, and to know, I guess, to think, what does a 12-year-old know? What don't they know? I think that is what I struggled with mainly.
So was it always a middle grade book when you came up with the idea, or did it start? Because I quite often start thinking I'm writing an adult book and then it turns into an adult.
Yes, actually, I guess mainly I said I wanted to write a children's book, middle grade book, that dealt with grief, that dealt with mental health, with poetry, and I guess I merged them all together, and that is how Sadé exists today.
Well, so was that the starting point then, kind of the concept, and then did the characters and the plot and things come later?
Yes, so obviously one of my biggest influences for this book is Monster Calls. So other than obviously book influences, yes, I usually go on concepts first, and then the characters come usually after that.
Yeah, it depends for me. I think for Mina and the Undead, because New Orleans had such a big impact on me, and I quickly decided that I wanted it to be a Yorkshire girl like me who'd going to this completely different place. So I think for me it was the setting that came first, but quite often, yeah, maybe I think concept and character can steer me. But yeah, I think it really depends. Yeah, I was interested. I didn't know whether the idea of dealing with grief is such a kind of a heavy thing to carry. It's interesting how you decided early on that you were going to do that, and you did it so beautifully, so I'm glad you did. So I was wondering, you talked a lot about your characters and about all the different elements of writing Sadé, and I was wondering, what was the best thing about writing it and what was the hardest thing about writing it?
What would I say the best thing was? I think when it was finished.
I know that feeling.
I think mainly seeing it come together, because as I said, I base a lot of it on concept. So the idea that I just had grief, mental health, and poetry as my I guess starting point, and now it being a fully fledged book that works so well, I think I was just mainly proud that it got to that stage. So that was my favorite part, seeing the end product. I guess least favorite part was the editing process. I am not a fan of editing whatsoever. I prefer the writing process. So I think even though I was happy with the end product, getting there was definitely a struggle, I would say. Yeah, say that.
So how do you approach your editing? Do you have a particular method that you go, like, do you go for big edits first? Do you plot everything out? Like, what do you do with it?
So if it depends, am I doing with an editor or myself? Which
So say you are just editing it for yourself, what would you do as your step-by-step process?
Okay, so usually as I'm writing the first draft, I will keep an edit document. So along the way, I will naturally have things that I want to change, so I'll add it to that document.
Okay.
And then once I'm done, a spreadsheet is what I usually do. So I kind of map out what each chapter has in it, and I guess what changes I would like to make as well along the way. So that is how usually I edit. And I might do that once or twice through. Yeah.
That's really organized. I keep hearing the spreadsheet idea. I need to remember and actually do that next time. It sounds really good. Okay, so I think we've talked quite a bit about your middle grade. If we can move on to finding Folkshore now, so you need to put your kind of YA author hat back on.
Yes.
The place you feel more comfortable. So can you tell us about the plot of the book to begin with?
Finding Folkshore follows 16-year-old Fuller, who's having a tough time because her brother is scheduled for surgery. And also she's having doubts in terms of what she wants to do in life. So she loves film and photography, but there are a lot of expectations, especially from her parents. So on a school trip, Fuller gets stuck in this fantastical hidden place called Folkshore. So it's a hidden place in London. And this magical place is being gentrified. So essentially that is what it's about. Yeah.
I really liked how this book feels a bit like a call to action and a call to make you think as a reader about what's happening in society. And I liked the fact that I spent a lot of time trying to work out what the fairy tales were that you were referencing. And I was like, I think that character's that person, that one's that one. You bring in this element. Like, for a start, how did you decide which fairy tale elements you were going to draw on?
I think from the beginning, I wanted to subvert a lot of the fairy tale elements. Obviously, there are some parts that are the same, but I guess Finding Folkshore came about because I wanted a black Rapunzel with no hair. I guess being that a lot of with Rapunzel especially, a lot of the power was found initially in her hair until she cut it off. So I said, okay, I'm going to start with a black Rapunzel with no hair. Then we have Red Riding Hood with the grandma, so that part is still the same. But she's actually dating the wolf, in quotes. Yes. And there's Prince Charming, and he's Irish in this one. And there's also Cinderella, but she's a widow with 2 kids. So I guess there are parts I wanted to keep the same. So Cinderella met her late husband at a ball, actually. She so all of that element was the same. So I guess I wanted to subvert and keep some parts the same as well. Yeah.
I really like the fact that with this book, it feels quite contemporary and grounded in the types of characters that you can recognise, and then you had some elements that quite scary, Rachel. You scared me with some of your creatures and stuff. So did you find it challenging to incorporate sort of different genre elements, or did that just come quite naturally as you were writing?
I would say a bit of both. I guess you always have an idea of what you want your book to turn out as from the beginning, but as you write it changes. So there were creatures or elements that I didn't have before that I ended up adding in. So I would say a bit of both, but yeah.
And I think the other thing that I wanted to ask you about is, as I was listening to the blurbs with both of your books, I started to think, there's some commonalities in theme, characterization and things like that. Do you consciously have some threads of things that you want to keep in all of your books and things that you enjoy, or do you think that it's more of a kind of subconscious process?
I'm a big fan of killing characters. Joking.
Don't do that to us, Rachel, please.
Death always somehow finds itself into my books. But I love, I quite enjoy having a character, especially with contemporary fantasy, the base of them going through something. Obviously in each book is different, but then having that escape, I guess, into the fantastical. So I think that is definitely a staple of my books. Very Alice in Wonderland-esque, with the whole real life and then escapism as well, I would say.
Yeah, and I never really thought about the fact that contemporary fantasy, it means that you can kind of draw on both elements of it, can't you? Like, you can take the fantastical stuff that you like, but keep it grounded. I think that's why I enjoy your writing so much, because I find high fantasy sometimes so big and so kind of dense that I lose the enjoyment of it a little bit if it's really long. But I think that yours, like, the pace is really good, and obviously you can really focus in on character too. So another thing I wanted to ask you about is plotting, because I think that your books, they just sort of move along. I don't know, not like an absolute breakneck pace so you can't keep up, but they feel like they're just kind of, they drive you through the book, the plot. Is there something that you do to keep your plotting really tight and to keep the reader really engaged?
No, I'm terrible at plotting.
Really?
I'm terrible.
You can't tell from the finished book. So how do you get them from the point of being terrible at plotting? How do you end up with a really tightly plotted book?
Because I guess I have scenes in my head that I know I want to happen. So I'm saying in this book, this will definitely happen. These major plot points will happen, but I'm not sure roughly how we'll get there. So a lot of it is me trying to work out the in-between, and just making sure roughly I follow the 3-act structure very loosely, but roughly, so by 50% where should I be, and by 75% where should I be. So just roughly following that structure to know that I'm keeping up the pacing, because I know that's an issue if you don't, I guess, plot properly. Yeah.
So would you say you're a bit of a mixture of, is it a plant that people call it, where you're a bit of a plotter and you kind of let the story drive you at the same time? Do you do a bit of both then?
I would say I'm probably more of a pantser, but yes, I would say fake plotting, because I love writing a synopsis before I start, but a lot of the times I do not follow it. So yes, I would say a bit of both.
Did you just say you love writing a synopsis? I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that.
I do. I initially though, I like writing it because I'm like, oh, shiny new story. By the end, I'm like, no, I don't want to write this. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think I started as more of a pantser, and I'm trying to be a bit more of a plotter, because I found that with Mina too, particularly, I wrote myself into some corners by not plotting them out properly, and I was like, I've got to kind of unpick 10,000 words of absolute kind of mess. So I think for the next book I write, and the one I'm writing now, I'm trying to be a bit more methodical, but it's just not my natural way. I
don't know how people do it. I don't know.
I interviewed Bryony Pierce, and she plots out in detail every single chapter, like fleshed out, even some of the stuff that people say, knows exactly what's going to happen. I just can't think of it before. I can't keep it all in my head.
I can't do it. And I love, because I'm very voice driven, I love the character or the characters driving the story. And sometimes they will make decisions that I haven't thought of. So I prefer for them to drive the story rather than me most of the time. Yeah,
and if that's the way you get your best stuff, I suppose it's just kind of trusting that process, isn't it? Knowing that you will get to the end, even though bits, like you said, the editing you don't enjoy can feel messy. We will get there.
Yes, I will.
Brilliant. So I've just got a couple more things I want to ask you, and then I'm going to ask you for some book recommendations. So get thinking if there's anything that fans of both of your books might enjoy, then we'll come to that towards the end. So I'm just going to check this. Okay. So in Finding Folkshore particularly, I was really struck by the setting of the book, and the fact that obviously it starts in the London we know, and then in this hidden place. How did you navigate between creating a realistic real setting and then a realistic fantasy setting?
I guess the realistic setting is always easier for me because I'm basing it off of what I know already and what I see around me. I struggle with world building. So I think a lot of it is just building off of things I want to see. So in Folkshore, the trees are connected and alive. So it's almost like one big organism, I would say. And that I guess is based off the fact that I wanted nature to feel alive there. So it's just literally adding on every so often different elements to make this world, to make this fantastical place, I would say.
So before we finish, I'd love to know, what are you working on now? Is there anything you can tell us?
So my book 2, MG, I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you roughly the themes and subjects that I explored in it. So it looks at homelessness and chronic pain and disability. So that is, I guess, what I can say.
Okay.
But it is very similar to Sadé in that there is contemporary and there's a fantasy element as well. So I won't spoil it too much, but yes.
Oh, I love that. That sounds so interesting. And I'll make sure to put your brains in that when we are not on camera. So before we finish then, can you tell us any recommendations? If anybody is thinking that they would really enjoy your books, are there any other books that you would recommend people read? I know you mentioned A Monster Calls. Is there anything else that you would recommend?
Yes, I actually have it here. So it's by a book by Aisha Bushby, A Flash of Firefly. So I've just started reading this, but it reminds me very much of my book. And both of our books explore difficult subjects with a fantasy element. Aisha Bushby's books are great. What should I read if you're reading my books?
Oh, yes. Awesome. Thank you so much. I don't actually have that one yet. I love Aisha's writing, so I'll definitely have to pick that one up. It sounds beautiful. I keep seeing it all over social media. Oh, thank you so much, Rachel. I knew I'd enjoyed talking to you. And I hope that everybody will go out and buy Rachel's books, and they're both available to pre-order now. So as I said, Finding Folkshore comes out in September, and Sadé and her Shadow Beast comes out on, is it the 7th of July?
7th of July.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay.
So thank you everyone for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the interview as much as I have. I have got some other author interviews lined up really soon, so stay tuned for those. Thanks very much for watching, and thank you, Rachel, for joining us. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.